All right. Sharing the notes again. So, all right. So last time we talked about a lot of stuff relating to Reconstruction. We got all the way through the Johnson presidency. And so today we really just need to talk a little bit about Grant. I feel like we talked about, excuse me for the deep breath there, impeachment, and really did kind of finish with Johnson. For our purposes, I'm not going to talk too much about the Grant presidency, not that it isn't important, not that you couldn't learn a lot from it, you probably could, but for our purposes, Grant was president for 2 terms, was mostly corrupt, but he wasn't, so people within the administration were, not so much him. We become much more concerned about money than civil rights or enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendment. So things are just kind of get progressively worse for African Americans in the South during the Grant presidency, especially the 2nd term, and then it all kind of falls apart. But I'm just about to give you a little bit more detail than that. Not much, but a little bit. All right. Sorry, Coke Zero. All right. So, Grant. Grant had been, you know who Grant was. Come on, I know you're in the South, but you still know who he was. He was the general who, he's commanding general for the Union Army during the Civil War, and he was a governor. What am I trying to say? He was governor of one of the 5 military districts that were created through congressional or radical Reconstruction. So he continued serving his country during the beginning of Reconstruction during the Johnson administration, and then runs for president and gets elected, you know, because he's Grant, because he's Grant. And if you wanted to read something about Grant for your book review, you could. That would be completely legit. I think the historian that just recently wrote about Grant is David McCullough. I think I was trying to think of that the other day. I think it's David McCullough, maybe not, I don't know. But it was somebody big. But there's a recent book about Grant that would talk about him as a general, but also talk about his presidency. So Grant becomes president, and stuff that's going on during the presidency that's kind of scandalous. Excuse me. There's a bribery scandal. His personal secretary, a guy named William Belknap, receives bribes to get access to the president. Also, there's bribery going on to get access to sales contracts at Native American reservations. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, is going to be the nickname, or the initials, excuse me. So people would pay money to get access to the BIA so they could get contracts to sell things and also purchase things on Native American reservations. And the big bribery scandal, or dishonesty kind of thing, it's not technically bribery, but it's something like that, is something called the Credit Mobilier. And if you're thinking, must have been a bunch of French people infiltrate, there's always foreign governments trying to infiltrate the United States. Darn French people. No, it wasn't that. They just called their company Credit Mobilier. And who are they? Congressmen. So some congressmen were issuing contracts that were paid for by the US government to build railroads in the West, federally funded railroad projects in the West. So these were pretty lucrative contracts. So these congressmen decided that they would form a fake company and they would bid on these contracts, and then they would award these contracts to themselves, and then they would subcontract with someone else. So they would pay them less than they awarded themselves to make the railroads, and then they would make a profit as a holding company, which was a front for these congressmen, and then they would subcontract to someone else to build the railroads. If you're wondering, is that illegal? I'm going to go with yes. Yes, that's illegal. It's essentially fraud. Now, during this time period, there aren't too many things that are illegal. That's one of the few, and they did it. They end up getting caught, and that, of course, is fairly scandalous for some congressmen. So you've got a lot of corruption that tends to surround money during this time period. I'm guessing that often corruption surrounds money. It certainly is in this era. And what you will notice when you read through the details in this section of the chapter is that there's definitely a political shift in the Republican Party. And the shift is away from that group of Republicans who said 14th and 15th Amendment are essential, and we need to make sure that African Americans have the same rights as white people. And I know we talked last time a little bit about how that probably is not the majority. Okay, it's not probably. It is not the majority position in the North or the Republican Party. However, it does tend to be the majority position among the people in power in the Republican Party. So guys like Lincoln, I know he's not around during Reconstruction, but most or all really of Lincoln's cabinet, some of the people who run the military. So a lot of the guys in the right positions really do think blacks and whites should be treated equally, whether the majority of anybody in the United States does or not. The guys in power do. As we get toward the end of the Johnson administration into the Grant administration, this is no longer true because one, a lot of those guys have died. Two, the rest of those guys who are still alive are now out of government pretty much. So almost everybody who was really radical as a Republican, radical extreme about equality is pretty much out of the political picture. And if you're wondering what takes over during this era, you know, is it states' rights versus federal rights? Is it equality versus discrimination? Not really. It's mostly money. We're starting to create a lot of money in this time period. I don't mean we're printing it. I mean our economy is growing a lot. Like right now, I think we're just printing it, but our economy is growing exponentially during this time period, which will, that time period after Reconstruction will be called the Gilded Age. It's coated in gold. It looks really flashy and shiny. So our economy is going to expand exponentially, you know, by a lot, to the point where we're going to create lots and lots of millionaires, which we really hadn't had before, and we will raise so much tax money, we're going to build a military, primarily a navy, because we didn't really have one before. So we're going to become a world economic force and a world military force at the same time. So there's just a ridiculous amount of money floating around. There's a ridiculous amount of government contracts floating around. And the political parties want to be involved in awarding those government contracts and cashing in on the money part as well. So they're going to accept bribes and campaign contributions, both. And there really just aren't very many rules about either of those things. So the political parties are going to become more important than the individuals who run for office, which is also why if I were to ask you right now, I should, shouldn't I? Who are some presidents after Grant, but before Teddy Roosevelt, you would say, can you think of any presidents between, without looking them up? I'm not trying to be rude at all. But can you think of any presidents in that era? Well, somebody knows something, maybe. Maybe not. I'm going to suggest to you, if you're paying attention, right? I'm going to suggest to you that part of the reason you don't know presidents during that era is they don't matter. No offense at all if you're related to one of them, but they're not as important as the political parties, and the parties aren't as important as the rich guys. So the rich guys give money to the political parties, and the political parties do what the rich guys want them to do. I know some of you are saying it's still that way. Yes and no. But this is a very extreme version of it in the Gilded Age. So we're transitioning to that, where parties don't really stand for anything except for, you know, they filter in the cash, and the political candidates essentially just do what they're told, otherwise they don't get elected. So parties control the politicians, rich guys control the parties. So This is an era of, we're ushering in an era of some amazing corruption during, in the Gilded Age. So we're moving away from an era where we're trying to correct the wrongs of the pre-Civil War era to an era where it's like, who cares? There's money. So, and both parties are going to be really focused on money. So this is going to be an era where it'll be hard to tell the Democrats from the Republicans. We'll have 2 or 3 of those eras in US history. I would argue to you in some ways now is one of those eras. You would probably not agree with me, but we'll talk about that later. You don't have to agree with me, by the way. Okay, so Grant becomes president, and what you notice is some corruption, but you do notice in his first presidency, he does tend to use the Force Acts or the Enforcement Acts or the KKK Acts to make sure that African-American voters are safe during elections. He does not do this in the second term, in part because all the corruption that I mentioned, but also he's distracted because he's ill and he's writing his memoirs because he needs to publish them before he dies to make sure that his family is taken care of financially after his death. Because he'd been a career military guy. They don't make that much money. Also, the Supreme Court is issuing rulings that say that states really don't have to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. Those are the ones that require equality and access to voting for former slaves, that really just has to happen at the federal level, which is a little tricky because the states control how you register to vote and they also run the federal elections within their states. But the Supreme Court says that federal government really can't stop states from discriminating. So there's really no federal support for the enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendment. So that means we're going to leave it to the southern states to make sure that blacks and whites are treated equally in the South. And do any of you expect that a southern state will go like, yeah, you know, we're wrong throughout most of our history, so we're going to fix that now? They're not in the mood. And as I probably have mentioned before, the North, the reason we're not talking about civil rights in the North is the vast majority of African Americans live in the South. And somebody in one of the earlier classes today said, you know, the book really doesn't cover a lot of discrimination that occurs in the North. It's like they're ignoring it. It's like, no, I'm sure Dr. Frono is aware of it. And there are some excerpts about it, you know, how you get those little sections where it says, oh, look at this picture, and here's something extra I want to talk to you about, which some of you guys ignore. Don't ignore those. It's extra. It's a bonus. Okay. But the book does mention those. It's just the main thing, you know, if you're talking about the day-to-day life of African Americans, it's more southern than northern during that era. Okay. So Grant's presidency ends with a real lack of support for former slaves in the South. And then you end up with an election in 1876. You know, we have those every 4 years, so nothing exciting about that. The parties pick their candidates. Parties always pick their candidates. Nothing new about that either. They pick Samuel J. Tilden as the Democrat, and the Republicans pick Rutherford B. Hayes. And these guys, apparently both kind of honorable dudes. There's nothing really wrong with either of these dudes. But as we get close to the end of the counting of the ballots for the election, it seems it's going to be super, super close in 3 or 4 states. I do sometimes forget which states, but I know one is South Carolina, I think one is Florida, and the other's something farther north. I think maybe New Jersey. Earlier I was thinking it was Illinois, but I think it's New Jersey. But anyway, there's 3 states where the votes are really close. So the Republican Party decides they will send people to help with the recount. And what they've noticed, their party leaders, is if they win all 3 of those states, then they will still lose the popular vote, but win the electoral vote, and then Hayes will become president. So magically, after they send help for the recount, the Republicans win all 3 of those states. Then the Democrats say, hey, something's up here, that's not right. We're going to send people also to help in the recount. So they do that, and their version of the recount, the Democrats win all 3. So then everybody's having an uproar. Oh my gosh, people cheated. What are we going to do? So when you have a contested election, you guys have any idea who's supposed to decide who's president? If you've done the normal thing, you counted the votes, the electoral college is kind of a mess. Who's supposed to decide who the president is? What are you going to do? Any thoughts? You can type it in if you don't want to talk. What did you say?
Is it Congress? I don't know.
Yeah, it is part of Congress. Nice job. So you send it to the House of Representatives. And that's the part of Congress where they're directly elected by proportion, by population. So states with more people have more people in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, everybody's got 2. In the House, it's proportionally representative. So the House is supposed to vote. The South, which is primarily Democrats, says, hey, this is unfair because we still don't get to vote. I mean, they didn't ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment, but they said this is not fair. The North has an advantage, therefore Republicans have an advantage. If you do this and you pick Rutherford B. Hayes, we are going to have Civil War #2. We're not putting up with this. South Carolina said, we will secede. It's like, oh my gosh, are they starting that again? So what they decide to do in Congress and the House is they'll make a committee of 15 people, and those 15 people will decide the method by which we pick the president. So essentially, those 15 people are going to pick the president. They pick 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent. So honestly, one person's going to pick the president, and then that independent is off the committee. They replace him with a Republican. They vote what they want to do, 8-7, and they decide we're just going to declare Hayes the president. Then the South just flips out again, as you would expect. They're like, that is not fair. This is exactly what we were afraid would happen. We are going to secede again. We're going to have another problem. And then they go like, wait. Let's just have a talk about this and we'll come to a compromise. Okay. So the compromise or the bargain of 1877 is how Reconstruction ends. So what they decide, and I noticed in my notes I put South, S for South and N for North, but when I'm putting South, I really do mean Democrats. So, and I didn't mention that here. Sorry for scrolling, I didn't mean to scroll there. There. So the South favors the Democrats and the North favors the Republicans. So the South or the Democrats get a cabinet member, ends up being the Postmaster General if you're interested. A railroad from Texas to California, which is super helpful with commerce, and Transcontinental Railroad and a more northern route. So this is pretty helpful. The North gets the presidency. So the Republicans get President Rutherford B. Hayes, who gets the nickname Rutherford B. Hayes. And the South gets what they really want. The troops are out, 5 military districts are over, and then they get to have elections however they want, as long as they have to promise to uphold civil rights in the South, to make sure that nobody keeps African Americans from voting, and to make sure that things are fair for Blacks. And they go like, of course we will. Why would you think we wouldn't? So the South promises to uphold civil rights in the South. The North says, great, that's all we ever wanted. Takes the troops out. And then we're just back to the way we were before the Civil War as far as picking representatives from the South. What you will notice if you look at voting statistics, participation statistics, is that African Americans do not vote in any meaningful numbers after 1876, again until 1968. So this bargain of 1877 is what officially ends Reconstruction, and what they really, really liked was that. The South was very willing to trade the presidency for getting the troops out of the South and getting to redo their state governments however they felt best. So that's how Reconstruction ends. So this bargain of 1877 thing is a pretty big deal. Did I have to tell you that? No, of course not. Of course not. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. See if you guys have any questions before we go to talking about the question of the day. Sorry, question of the week. I guess I have a question of the day, maybe. All right. I'm going to take just a second because I didn't really do a very good job of taking roll, so I apologize for that. You guys are sure you don't want to ask anything? I mean, you don't have to. All right. There's one person that's never come, but I think we've talked about that person before. They moved. All right. I know I told you this last time, but I got the email from somebody that said you guys are going back to campus. Are you going back to campus? Some of you?
Yeah, so I think the freshmen are going back first,
Yeah,
and then like the seniors and stuff, and it's gonna be like in different phases.
got it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So good luck on that. Wash your hands a lot. It's going to be my advice to you. And don't breathe on each other. And, wear the mask. And don't switch masks with people. Like, hey, your mask is cooler than mine. Can we switch? Don't do that. Okay. That's the end of my advice. The one thing that I always noticed, my high school teaching days, is that you guys are terrible about washing your hands, honestly. Like even after you go to the bathroom and stuff. So wash your hands, wash them a lot, okay? That's my best advice to you. And if you got an old teacher, don't go breathe on them because they're nervous, you know what I'm saying? All right, but good luck to you. I honestly think you'll be okay. I think you'll be okay. But I know that some people are super nervous. And if you're one of them, I'm sorry. I think we're going to continue online, if I read everything correctly. And that's also, I think, in part why you guys get the extra 30-minute sort of thing, where that's why we don't log on, when we're supposed to. Except sometimes we log on and watch a soccer game. I don't know whose idea that is. And thank you guys so much for putting your names in, and not the way that I'm not even going to say. All right. Okay, so the weekly question, which I'll put up in just a second, is, was Reconstruction a success or a failure? Now, some just basic questions that I've had people ask about the weekly question. Does it matter what format I put it in? It's like, I don't know. So I don't care what font you put it in, if that's what you mean. I don't care if you double space or not. Because even if you use like tiny font, I can make it larger so you can't, play some senior citizen joke on me or anything. So I don't care. What I do care about is complete sentences. So make sure that you write in complete sentences instead of making lists of stuff. Because I had people over the summer, it's one person, I kept telling them, stop doing bullet points, but they just kept doing bullet points. The problem with bullet points, because I know some of you is like, well, it's organized, it's simple, you get the information. Yeah, you kind of get the information, but what I don't get is explanations of stuff. I just get a list of stuff. I don't need I don't want just a list of stuff. I want to know why you think stuff's important. So you can't just make lists, okay? No bullet points. It's the other thing. Complete sentences, no bullet points. And there's one other thing I was going to tell you. What is it? Oh, weird problem that I had over the summer too is people who put in answers that were shorter than the question. Your answer cannot be shorter than the question. My assumption is that your answer is about a page long. Now, it could be longer. It should not be shorter in most instances. Now, I know some of you are going to say, but I'm a really concise writer. You're not that concise. So make sure you explain stuff. And remember, you only have one question a week. So it's not like I'm asking you to write a 5-page essay every week. You're answering one question a week, which is probably about a page long. So I think it's very reasonable. You may not, and we'll figure that out. Also, again, part of the reason I think you should turn it in earlier than the 18th is to get feedback. So that way you'll know, like if I don't think there's enough detail, then you'll know for question 2 and 3 to put in more detail. Also, you may or may not have noticed, I put in a sample question and answer on the course documents page. So look at that, and that'll give you kind of an idea how to go about it, kind of. That doesn't fit perfectly with this question, but we'll talk about this question in a minute. Also, I don't know if you noticed, but in the course documents section, there's a study for the quiz page that has a list of things that you should study for the quiz on the 18th, okay? All right. Let's look at the question. You ready? Where is the question? There it is. Weekly question. All right. And again, type in questions or shout them out if you have them if I'm ignoring you. Now, this I just typed in today, so you didn't have this on the question. So, was Reconstruction a success or a failure? Or was it something in between? In your response, consider land policy, key legislation during presidential and radical Reconstruction, Southern politics, racial and political violence, and Northern fatigue with Reconstruction. Be sure to make clear what you mean by success and failure. Okay. Now, the first thing I would do if I were you, first paragraph. See, I'm thinking on this one, you got like a 3 or 4 paragraph thing going on. You don't have to do that. That's what I'm thinking. And when I'm writing an answer like this, the first thing I think of is what is my strategy in answering it? So how am I going to organize my answer? Now, I used to teach high school for a long time, and I even taught at a school that you're familiar with. So what I noticed was in your English classes, if you just took the, the on-level English class, and honestly, even if you took the other fancy English class, the only thing you guys ever wrote about was literature. So first thing, as a history teacher, I don't want to know how you feel about stuff. I don't mean you personally in your life. I do care deeply as much as I'm supposed to care about you. I mean in your answers. So don't tell me how you feel about Reconstruction or if Reconstruction made you sad. I kind of expect it probably did. And don't talk about characters or the plot. This is history, so we don't have characters, we don't have a plot, and I don't know if we have feelings or not. We probably don't. So this is kind of like facts and cause and effect. Facts, cause and effect, and what's the overall impact of it. I also know some of you took those AP classes as well, and I don't know if the AP World History class still does this. It used to drive me crazy. They would say, like, do we need to discuss the voice not heard? It's like, oh, no, you just need to answer the question. Don't talk about the voice not heard. And also, it was AP World History. AP World History caused me fit because I taught AP US. But they had a teacher who would tell them, just say anything that possibly happened during that time period, whether it's true or not, and whoever reads this will weed out the stuff that isn't true, and they'll just accept the stuff that is true. No, that kind of ruins your credibility in a history class. So we only want stuff that's true, and we want to know details. So we want facts. They have to be true. You can't just guess. And your feelings, we probably don't care about your feelings. Sorry. Okay. So if I'm looking at this question, and I know they also teach you to write to answer STAR test questions. Yeah, nobody cares about STAR. Sorry. I know you do. You want to pass. But beyond that, you don't care. So that's not super helpful. What you want to do here is figure out your strategy. So the first thing I would do, because I'm asking you about Reconstruction, I want to know, do you even know what Reconstruction is? I'm not trying to be rude at all, but do you know what Reconstruction is? So, first paragraph, intro. I'm defining Reconstruction. So what is Reconstruction? When did it happen? Why did it happen? What was the thing that happened before it that caused it to happen? Because we do love cause and effect. Also, we do tend to like stuff to be discussed chronologically because that helps you show cause and effect. Because if this happened first, then that happened, then that happened, it could be that this caused this, which caused that. You know what I'm trying to say? Maybe. I don't know. Okay. So chronology is kind of nice, and definition. So very first thing, I'm just telling you, if I'm writing this, my first paragraph is, Reconstruction was the period of time after the Civil War where the country attempted to put the North and South back together politically, mostly politically, but anyway, okay. And then you could mention who the president is. There are other things you could mention, but don't make it like super long, but at least let me know that you know what Reconstruction was and when it happened. Put some dates in there. Mention, Johnson became president. Dates, details, okay. All right, now that's not your main part of this, but that's where you want to start. What is Reconstruction? And then if you would like, in your introduction, you could mention something like, the goal of Reconstruction was to make sure, whatever you think the goal was, perhaps it's to make sure that former slaves in the South had equal rights and were able to get a new start in life, whatever you think the goal of Reconstruction was. Maybe you're going to be super cynical and say, goal of Reconstruction was, the North making sure that blacks stayed in the South. There's definitely some of that that's true as well. But say something that you think the facts support, okay? So talk about what the goal or a goal or some goals of Reconstruction were. So define it, what were the goals? And then you might mention if you thought it was successful or not. Or you may say one of those to, I know you love to do this in AP classes, to a certain extent it was successful, while in other ways it was not. So it's just a little bit like comparison contrast kind of thing. You could say that. You could just say, overall, there were many successes, but it was a failure, something like that. So you decide complete success, complete failure, or to a certain extent, a success and a failure. Your decision. You can support any of those conclusions. You really can. So we've got an intro that defines Reconstruction, perhaps mentions the purpose of Reconstruction, and then maybe mentions whether you thought it was a failure or success. You also, if you'd prefer, can wait and put that at the end. What I would do next, again, you don't have to do it, but what I would do next is probably have a paragraph about the things that I thought were successful in Reconstruction and the things that I thought were not successful in Reconstruction. So I'd have a good stuff paragraph and a bad stuff paragraph. I think that's what I would do. You could also, you don't have to do that. Maybe you just go through Reconstruction chronologically and talk about the things that happened. So you got a chronological retelling of Reconstruction, and then your next paragraph maybe is an analysis of which of those things were good and which of those things were bad. Or you could go through it chronologically, and as you go through it, say, this is what was good and this is what was bad about those things. You could also arrange it, here's what happened while Johnson was president, here's what happened while Grant was president. You have a variety of strategies here, any of which are valid. You just have to do whatever seems to make the most sense for your argument. Okay? All right, so you've either gone through it chronologically, you've gone through it by presidencies, or you've said good stuff, bad stuff. So now you've got, your introductory paragraph, you've got the stuff in the middle, which is who knows how many paragraphs, 2, 3, however you organize it. And then at the end, that's where you analyze, you do your final conclusion, where you talk about, even though these things were good, the bad outweighed the good, and the end result was this, that, or the other thing. Now, when you're talking about stuff, details, you have to be specific. So I want to know names of people or events or laws, when they happened, maybe why they happened. So when you've got all these suggestions, consider land, all this stuff here. Okay, so land policy. You could talk about how some of the land was taken away from slave owners, plantation owners, and given to slaves during the Civil War, and how there was discussion that that would be done on a larger scale during Reconstruction. Now, if you talk about that, you do need to mention that never really happened, but you could also mention when it did happen, and the book does have details about this, talks about General Sherman and land orders and that kind of stuff. You can mention that when it did happen, it was successful, but when Johnson administration decided they did not want to do that and actually returned the land to the former slave owners, any land that had been redistributed. You could also talk about sharecropping and the crop lien system in here. Somebody mentioned that in the last class. I go, yeah, you could do that. I mean, that's not officially land policy, but it's a land use, and I wouldn't be upset with you for doing that. That makes sense. Key legislation during presidential and radical Reconstruction. Okay. I would talk about the Reconstruction Act that set up the 5 different military districts. And I think if you don't mention that we passed 3 amendments during this time period, I think that's a problem because we hardly ever pass amendments. We've only had 28 total, and the first 10 were in a group. So we really only had 18, since the Constitution was ratified. So we got 3 during this time period. That's a big deal. Also, when you mention those amendments, don't just say we passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, because if you say that, do I have any idea whether you know what those amendments do? No. So you have to explain them. You don't have to explain them in paragraphs, but you do have to say we passed the 13th Amendment. You could put in parentheses, freed the slaves. 14th Amendment, you could put in parentheses, citizenship and equal protection under the law. And then 15th Amendment, you could put in parentheses, voting for former slaves. So you don't have to spend paragraphs explaining it, but don't just list them. So when you write this and you talk about legislation, if you don't mention the amendments, I think you've made a mistake. You can also talk about the Freedmen's Bureau. You could talk about the Force Act. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there you could talk about. Okay. Radical Reconstruction, of course, is the Congressional Reconstruction or military Reconstruction. So, mention that. Southern politics, I think I would mention that most of the South is Democrats and that they're recreating slave codes as Black codes, and they're adding different requirements or restrictions on the freedom of former slaves. And the book talks about that a little more specifically. Racial and political violence, I think that's just saying, don't forget to mention the creation and rise of the KKK. I think that kind of goes in there. And Northern fatigue with Reconstruction, that is, what happens in the Grant administration, and, you can speculate as to why that happens. That's going to be a little more general. And then as you conclude, when you say it was a success or a failure, you have to say why. So if you argue that it was a failure, you can't ignore that some good things happen. There were, and you'll notice as you go back through and look at the details, there's some African-American men who get elected to Congress. There's some who get elected and go to DC. There's some African-American guys who start colleges, who become prominent. I mean, there's wealth that's created, there's success. So you can't ignore that, but you could talk about how that was not the case for a majority of people, how in general African Americans tended to remain poor and probably worked for their former owners. But you can't ignore that some people were successful, or that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were important. So you could say, in spite of the success of some individuals and the very important creation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, because land wasn't redistributed and the amendments were not truly enforced, in general, equality was still very difficult to attain. I mean, you could say stuff like that and it'd be okay. Or you could argue that because the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were created, that sets up the possibility of equality, which we achieved later. So in that way, it was successful. You can argue whatever you like. It just has to make sense, and you have to explain why you're arguing what you argue. I also will note here, I think you're making a mistake as well if you don't mention that this is how and why Reconstruction ends, and it's a signal that the federal government is no longer serious about protecting the rights of African Americans. Some of you might argue they never were terribly serious, but here it's official. I mean, they just say, okay, South, protect the rights of Blacks in your states. We'll trust that you'll do this. All right. That's a lot of talking on my part. And it's crud. It's almost time to go. Why don't you people tell me this stuff? All right. So if you were to talk about everything in your book that's listed in this question in great detail, you would really write 4 or 5 pages. I don't expect that you'll write that many pages. I don't. I expect, at least 1, maybe 2. But as you're writing, be specific and look at the details that are available in your book, okay? Now, my thought is your textbook should be your main source of information. Your textbook, maybe my lectures, hopefully they're a little bit helpful, but your textbook is much more specific than my lectures are. Honestly, if I were you, I'd read the book first, and then the lectures probably will remind you of stuff that you read, but details from your textbook. Look, I know you could just look stuff up online, but I really am designing questions that fit with the information in your textbook because my expectation is you'll use the textbook. And if you're wondering why, because it's trustworthy, because it's a good source. Now, I've also had some people already point out, well, but it's not necessarily like the most diverse source, and it doesn't show all sides of the issues. It's like, oh my gosh, the textbook would have to be huge to do that. Now, I'm not saying it shouldn't try, and I kind of think that the Foner Fellow does a pretty good job of including, multiple perspectives, but, it's not Zinn, the Howard Zinn People's History of America, and it's not, an individual piece of history, a monograph, what we would call, where you've got a single author who specifically talks about minority perspectives on this during that certain era. The point of the textbook is to give you just a broad overview, kind of a foundational US history, and then you add to that as you go, which you could do with the book review if you like. Okay. All right. I'm done talking for a minute. You guys have questions you would like to ask? Because it's almost time to go. You could stay and ask questions, so it wouldn't bother me. Do you have any questions about how to write, what to write, when to write, when it's due? You submit it to the assignment section of the Blackboard page. And if I were you, even if you paste it in, because somebody asked me, can I type it directly into the assignment? You can, absolutely, that's fine, I think. However, you need to keep a copy of it, because sometimes, you've used technology before, it doesn't always work. So make sure that you keep a copy of whatever you turn in, even if you type directly into the assignment, copy and paste that into a Word document and save it somewhere, okay? Because, if you tell me oh no, I submitted it, but you didn't get it, sorry, you're gonna have to turn it in. You're gonna have to, okay?
I have
All
a
right.
question.
Please
Are
ask
we
a
going to
question.
need any quotes?
I don't know, if somebody says something in the book that you think's worth quoting, feel free. For your book review, you absolutely have to have some, but for this, if you see something cool, put it in there. That's fine. But if you don't, that's fine too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, there are probably a dozen different ways you could do this and it would be fine. Not as true with the book review.
So do we need to have evidence from the textbook? Like in English, how we would cite stuff, or?
You don't have to cite stuff. You just have to make sure that whatever you say is true, if that makes any sense. Now,
Okay, cool.
Yeah, my assumption is your source is the textbook. Now, if you quote something directly, yeah, you've got to put quotation marks around it. Otherwise, I'm going to think you're plagiarizing. But, if you say, the Reconstruction Act created 5 military districts that were governed by former Civil War generals, that's cool. I mean, as long as it's not word for word from the textbook. And I'm going to assume that you're going to tell me stuff you probably didn't know before you read the textbook. But yeah, anything word for word, you got to quote. But I assume you're going to be paraphrasing quite a bit. Yeah, I had somebody super nervous in the last class because I guess they just hate writing. And I told him, if you're super nervous, you can send me your draft ahead of time and I'll give you some feedback. However, not every time you turn something in and not the night before it's due. So those are my disclaimers. Because, I do want to be helpful, but I'm not going to be helpful, at 11 p.m. the night something's due. Because, the truth is I'm probably not going to read your stuff at 11 p.m. the night before it's due. But yeah, if you're early, shoot, I'll be as helpful as I can because I know this is a process for anybody taking their first history class in college. So I get it. All right. Anything else you want to ask before you go? I know some of you are looking at the clock. You're like, she's over a minute. Oh, come on. Don't be mean. Is there anything you guys want to ask
We're
before
a
you go?
minute late, so it's fine. The minute makes up.
Okay. Yeah, I was a minute late too, so I'm sorry about that. Soccer. I know. You have to have priorities. But I was also 30 minutes early. Goodness. All right. Anything else you guys want to ask before you go? Feel free to email questions. I also had somebody ask if I had office hours. I don't really, but for your class, the 30 minutes before class is a good time. And if you'd rather talk in a Zoom meeting than by email, just let me know and what a good time might be and we'll work on it. All right, I'm going to say we're officially done. I'm going to stop recording and I'll post it.